This is video number 3, factoring a trinomial where the leading coefficient is not 1. And we're not including perfect square trinomials in this video. So number 7, we have 5x squared minus 9x minus 2. The first thing you should always do for any type of factoring problem is just check for a greatest common factor. So I'm looking at all of the coefficients and constants in the problem, and I can see that the greatest common factor of 5, 9, and 2 is a 1. So I'm not going to be factoring out a greatest common factor. Now let's say that I wanted to start number 7 like I had in the last video, where I immediately went and wrote the parentheses down and tried to break apart the 5x squared. Well, 5x squared can be broken apart pretty quickly by writing 5x times x. So I would write 5x in one group and x in the other. However, I could use trial and error to figure out what goes into these two last positions. Now what I'm going to do instead is show you a more formal method of factoring something where the coefficient is larger than 1. So some people call this factoring by grouping. Or splitting the middle term. I've heard that before, splitting the middle term. And I've also heard this called the AC method. Now, in order to use AC method, I need to define what that is. So I'm going to go ahead and erase what I wrote here and talk about AC method. So we have this quadratic here. The generic form of a quadratic expression is ax squared plus bx plus c, where a, b, and c are the constants and coefficients of this particular problem. So you'll notice that the a term here in this problem, a is 5, b is -9, and c is -2. Now those values are going to come in handy, the a value and the c value, if I choose to use the AC method or factoring by grouping or splitting the middle term. So that's what I'm going to do. So I'm going to take and multiply together my A and my C. So I have 5 times 2, or 5 times -2, which is -10. And what I'm going to do is list all the factor pairs of -10 rather than -2. This 5 actually impacts the pieces of foil as you're working through it. So I'm going to go ahead and just do those factor pairs for -10. And you don't have to worry about the signs until you go to check your work. So 10 is made from 1 times 10 and 2 times 5. And I'm looking to make a middle term of -9. So if I add or subtract 1 and 10, I get 9 or 11. And if I add or subtract 2 and 5, I can get a 3 or a 7. So I definitely want to look at this 1 and 10. My last term is negative, so I need opposite signs, so plus and negative, and I need more negatives than positives to make a -9, so that's a -10 and a +1. So what I'm going to do is split the middle term and rewrite my trinomial as 4 terms instead. So I'm going to leave the 5x squared, and then I'm going to break this apart into a +1x and a -10x. And it doesn't matter which one that you write first, this is up to you. So I'm going to go ahead and write plus 1x, or just plain x, minus 10x minus 2. From here, what you're going to do is group together the first and last 2 terms. So the 5x squared and the x will be in the first group, and my second group will be the -10x and the -2. You do want to put a plus sign in between your 2 groups because the operation currently is still addition. Next step, go ahead and factor the greatest common factor out of each group separately. So the first 2 terms, the greatest common factor is an x, and the leftovers are 5x plus 1. You're dividing each of these by x. Then I have the plus sign, but notice I have a -10x minus 2 over here. When I'm factoring out the greatest common factor, I'm going to pull the negative out because I want the leftovers in parentheses to look just like the first group that you see here, this 5x plus 1. So I'm going to factor out a -2. You divide both terms in the second group by a -2, you'll end up with 5x plus 1. And I know I've worked this correctly because of the fact that my 2 groups are identical to each other. So I have a common group of 5x plus 1. I'm going to write that down in parentheses. And then what I write in the other parenthesis is the leftovers. I have an x and minus 2 left over after I pulled out the greatest common factor. So your final answer is 5x plus 1 and x minus 2 as a product. And you should go and check your answers by foiling to verify that it matches your original. Let's go ahead and take a look at number 9. Number 9 requires a few extra steps. So for number 9, we've got 48x squared minus 242x plus 10. The first thing you should always do is check for that greatest common factor. And what I see is that I do have a common factor of 2, so I'm going to take that out. So I have 2, and then I have parenthesis 24x squared minus 121x plus 5. The nice thing about factoring out the 2 is your coefficients are a little bit smaller and they're a little bit easier to work with. So now what I'm going to do is use the AC method. Now that 2 is going to stay on the outside, but we're going to have to do some splitting of the middle term, and we'll put all of these expressions or all of these values into brackets instead. So I want to look for two values that when I multiply them together, so I'm going to actually start with the 24 times 5, and that's going to give me 120. And I'm looking for a factor pair that would add up to 121. Well, that's a pretty large value. If you list all of your pairs, you'll ultimately find that the only ones that'll work would be 120 times 1. Notice that your last term is positive, but your middle term is negative. This last term being positive can be made from positive times positive or negative times negative. Since my middle term is negative, I'm going to need both of these to be negative. So I'm going to split the middle term. So I still have 24x squared, but then I have minus 120x minus 1x plus 5, and then bracket. I'm going to go ahead and put a parenthesis around my first two terms, and then my last two terms. Make sure you keep a plus sign in here. So I'm going to go ahead and move the negative with the 1x term there. So I just kind of shifted things over. So now I have 2. And I'm going to go ahead and factor out the GCF of each group here. So 24x squared minus 120x. The greatest common factor here is going to be 24x. And in parentheses, I have x minus 5. And over here, I'm going to pull out the negative 1. And I'll have x minus 5 as well. And I'm going to go ahead and write a little bit over here because I'm running out of room. So within the parentheses, I've got my common group, which is x minus 5, and my leftovers, which is 24x minus 1. Just a little hint on number 10 when you get to it. It's a good idea when you take out the greatest common factor to also take out a negative. It's easier to factor when your leading coefficient is positive.